Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Nemeth Report podcast. I'm Dr. Tammy Nemeth, energy historian, analyst, consultant, and I'll be your host. Today, I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by the Honorable Jason Isaac, founder and CEO of the American Energy Institute. We're going to be talking about dark green money, climate litigation, and energy literacy, which is near and dear to my heart. Hi, Jason. Welcome to the program.
Hi, Tammy. Thanks for having me on. It's great to be on.
Well, I've listened to you talk to David Blackman, and I've been following your organization. And, you've been this staunch advocate for abundant, reliable, and affordable energy for some time. And before we dive into the conversation, I'm wondering if you can just take a moment to introduce yourself to our audience.
Sure. I'm Jason Isaac. I'm the founder and CEO of the American Energy Institute. As you mentioned, I'm also known as the Carbon King, anointed by a Democrat member of Congress when I testified before the U.S. House of Representatives. I think this was my third or fourth time testifying before Congress. And I lead in and I tell people, I introduce myself and I say, hi, I'm Jason Isaac and I live a high carbon lifestyle. And I think the rest of the world should too. And apparently those comments didn't sit too well with a member of Congress, and he kind of wagged his finger at me and called me the Carbon King. But before I was the Carbon King, I worked at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, a think tank based in Austin, Texas, just a couple blocks south of our capital in Texas, which was not a far commute for me after serving 4 terms in the Texas House of Representatives. I did move those 2 blocks south to go work and lead their energy and environment initiative at the Texas Public Policy Foundation called Life Powered. The short mission statement was to raise America's energy IQ. Worked on energy education projects, just worked with the administration, the first Trump administration, worked with members of the legislature around the country. And out of that organization kind of grew some frustrations with existing trade organizations that are supposed to represent energy companies and the employees and the consumers of their products, that they were really embracing political agendas. And so I sat out about a year long doing research, looking into trade organizations and kind of pulling the layers of the onion back and realizing that over the last 100+ years, some of these trade organizations had actually changed their mission statements and really started embracing things like the Paris Climate Accords, and which isn't the law of the land in the United States. I think it's treasonous that companies and trade organizations are aligning with a foreign treaty that hasn't been ratified by the U.S. Congress. But that really led me to leave the foundation in good graces. Now I'm a supporter of the work of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, continue to be a big fan and close friends with many people that work there, and start a new trade organization that represents free markets and American energy companies. We primarily represent companies in the oil, gas, coal, and nuclear space, but giving a voice to those companies that push back on political agendas, things like ESG, DEI, net zero, decarbonization, Paris Accords. We're for affordable and reliable energy. And actually, I have the blessing of my board members to go out and advocate for policies that reduce the cost of energy. Our mission statement, also short and simple: liberate American energy. So that's kind of some of the work that I've done over the last 15 to 20 years, serving in the legislature, working on energy policy, and now leading a trade organization.
Yeah, and it's so great on your website because you have all of this really great material talking about how energy literacy can combat these sensationalist narratives that we get out there, and how it can support informed policy decisions. And I just want to put up on the screen here this comparison of growth areas and declining emissions, because quite often in the narrative we hear, oh my gosh, pollution is so bad, and they call CO2 pollution, which is just offensive, actually. So when you think of what the regular sort of pollution that we think of when we hear that word, you can see in this chart, which is from the EPA, it shows the increase of GDP. And then we also have how the particulate matter, the aggregate emissions, the purple one there is the really bad one, which is like the 6 common pollutants, the NOx and the SOx and everything else. And then we can see all of this is from abundant hydrocarbons that are reliable and affordable. At the same time, we have this decline in things that you could say is air pollution and whatnot. And I would just like sort of your views on seeing the actual graph there.
This is a great chart. I've used this in several of my presentations, and we focus on, we're a world leader here in North America, and really there's about 1 billion people on the planet that get to experience what we take for granted. That's access to running water, electricity. We typically take those for granted. There's 7 billion people on the planet that don't get to experience access to clean and safe drinking water, that don't get a lot of electricity, access to electricity. But this chart really talks about some of the environmental leadership that we've seen in these developing countries that live a high carbon lifestyle, that have high per capita CO2 emissions. They have clean air and they have clean water. And you talk about the 6 criteria pollutants. These are the pollutants that were identified in the Clean Air Act that in certain concentrations may impact human health. And the US said, hey, let's start reducing those. And before the Clean Air Act was passed, we were already on this trajectory of reducing those significantly. Clean Air Act was passed in the 70s. You look at the decade in the 60s, those pollutants were already coming down because consumers were demanding things like catalytic converters in cars to reduce pollution. Being a former politician, I can make fun of politicians. I say the Clean Air Act was passed as this way for members of Congress to really pat themselves on the back and say, look what we did. We made this possible, when it was already trending in that direction. But you look, since the Clean Air Act has been in place, those criteria pollutants have reduced 80%, nearly 80% over the last 5 decades. And I love that you have vehicle miles traveled on this particular chart, because it allows me to go into a great talking point. People keep talking about wanting to reduce those criteria pollutants even more. We're so far beyond anything that would impact human health and reducing them. And I love it that during the first 2 months of the COVID lockdowns, it gave us some really good opportunities to do research. Because I heard an electric vehicle lobbyist say, it was several months after that period, but he was giving this online symposium, and he was saying we need to go 100% electric vehicles because we took half the cars off the road during the lockdown, and our air quality improved so much that gives us justification for mandating 100% electric vehicles. And I thought, wow, what an absurd thing to say. What about the people that lost their jobs, lost their lives, lost their homes? I mean, there was such an economic devastation during those first 2 months of the COVID lockdowns. And I'm thinking, this heartless guy is just pushing EVs. And I'm like, let's do the research. I want to know how much the air quality did improve. And in particular, in the city of Austin, where we were doing this research and where he made this claim that the air quality improved so much, we looked at the air quality monitors. The United States, North America, has more air quality monitors than anywhere on the planet. So we can track this. And the air quality in the city of Austin during the first 2 months of the COVID lockdowns, with half of the vehicles being taken off the road, got worse. It was negligible, but it got worse. The data showed it. And so I was like, oh, is this the group that really trusts the science? No, they don't. They're just out there spewing a narrative. But it just shows me that we could take half the cars off the road, our air quality doesn't improve. In some cases, it gets worse. It's negligible. But we're in a natural state when it comes to air quality here in the United States. We've become world leaders in clean air. And that's something that we take for granted here. So I love that you show this chart. And one thing, this chart, we talks about energy consumption, where that number is maybe a little bit flat, but energy production has gone through record levels. We're now producing more oil, more gas, more coal than we have over the last decade. These are incredible record numbers. So I think that's a good thing. And I tell people we produce energy more responsibly than anywhere on the planet here in the United States and North America. And we should be producing more of it to lift the world's poor out of poverty. And we've done this while improving our air quality and our access to clean and safe drinking water.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Especially like if there's I think it's Human Progress from Marion Tupy, where they have the Human Progress Project, and they have all of these amazing statistics that show when you increase reliable, affordable energy, then that there's a correlation, and some would say causation, to improving the environment in those jurisdictions. So it's like, if you're not worrying about where your energy is coming from, and energy is the lifeblood of industry, if you're not worried about where it's coming from and that it's affordable, then you can focus on looking after the environment and making sure you have clean air and clean water and all of the other things that, as you say, we take for granted in North America and the Western world.
Yeah, it's a great point. One of my close friends, Chris Wright, happens to be the Secretary of Energy in the United States. He has this great presentation, this great image that he shows, and it's the Dominican Republic and Haiti. I mean, these are the same geology. I mean, this is an island that's split in half, and from satellites, you can see the border. And it's not because there's this imaginary line there. It's because the poor half of the island has completely deforested. The wealthy half of the island that has access to affordable and reliable energy hasn't. They're not cutting down trees to use as fuel anymore. They're using more dense energy, propane, natural gas, oil, gas, coal, those things that actually allow economic prosperity to happen. But this is the exact same geology. And so that's what happens when you live in poor places or economically developing countries. They're going to use wood. They're going to use anything they can to burn, to make heat, to boil water, to make it somewhat potable. And so there's just this clear delineation on the same geology, the same geography on an island that you can clearly see the border from satellite, because trees, no trees, poverty, no poverty. And it's really energy stark. Poverty, prosperity is what it is, because energy poverty is poverty.
Yes, exactly. So I'd kind of like to go in the direction of climate lawfare, because if poverty is energy poverty, and there's all this litigation out there that is intended to stop the production and use of hydrocarbons, and in different circles it's called climate litigation or climate lawfare. And you guys wrote this recent report. I'm just going to put it up on the stage here, called Climate Lawfare, Advancing the Green New Deal by Lawsuit. And we've seen this in Canada, in the European Union, in the United States, that whenever legislation doesn't go the way that certain activist groups want it to go, they file a lawsuit. And I know that in the American system, there's been a bit of a revolving door between groups like the Natural Resources Defense Council, the NRDC, and the EPA, where certain challenges were made and then settlements done in order to progress climate action through lawfare or these different kinds of moves. And so I'm wondering if you can explain some of the key mechanisms that you've articulated in your report about climate lawfare.
Yeah, we actually published the first version of this report, I think about 1.5 years ago. We've updated again this year, and the investigations that have come out of have been just phenomenal. Senator Ted Cruz, one of my Texas senators, has led an investigation in the U.S. Senate. Jim Jordan has led an investigation in the U.S. House. But this dark money that's fueling this so-called Environmental Law Institute is a nonprofit. They're doing this Climate Judiciary Project that they started in 2018 with the goal to go out and taint judges. They developed 13 training modules to taint judges on so-called climate science, if you will. Some of these have this attribution science that there's a professor who says that he can go back into the 1700s, which I'm like, okay, that's pretty far, and determine the pollution, the so-called pollution from fossil fuel companies. And like, okay, I didn't know there were many fossil fuel companies from the 1700s, but he can determine which emissions from the 1700s are attributable to which company, and which weather events have been caused because of this. This attribution science is what it's called, but it's been completely debunked by left-wing organization, yet it remains in some of the training modules that the Environmental Law Institute uses to give to judges. To date, it's over 2,000 judges at over 50 events that they've used. And one thing that really kind of blows my mind is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the state of Hawaii has participated in these events, endorsed these events, and actually refuses to recuse himself from the climate nuisance lawsuit that's happening in Hawaii, where Hawaii is suing some of the majors. The majors aren't members of my trade organization. They've kind of, as I say, they've been an appeaser. They feed the crocodiles, hoping they'll be the last ones eaten, with their Winston Churchill reference there. As I like to say at the American Energy Institute, we don't feed the crocodiles, we wear them. But they've kind of embraced some of these political agendas that are now, I think, coming back to bite them. But in this particular case in Hawaii, they're suing all the majors, the Exxon, Chevron, these other companies, Shell, BP, saying that they've affected the weather in Hawaii. The one interesting thing in this lawsuit here, well, there's several interesting things, but the one that really points out to me is the only one that's not named in the lawsuit is the only refinery in the state of Hawaii is not named in the lawsuit. And it just happens to be that company and the people behind that company give heavily to Democrats in the state of Hawaii. So it just shows the hypocrisy of this, but this judge refuses to recuse himself, even though he's participated in these events that have been set up to rig the game, if you will, before the game even makes it through the process. And it's now playing through the process. There's a few commonalities. You've got groups like the Hewlett Foundation, which are funding Scher Edling, a law firm in San Francisco, where this law firm will come into these municipalities like Puerto Rico. They've gone to the island of Puerto Rico and said, hey, we'll represent you for free. We're going to sue these companies because of a hurricane that was caused by these companies, which is just absurd. And when we win, we'll share some of the winnings with you, but we'll do this for free. Well, they're being funded by these dark money organizations that are really just trying to end the use of hydrocarbons. It's the globalist elite agenda, the climate change propaganda, if you will, to really drive up the cost of energy. It's about control. Well, in the case of Puerto Rico, there was a new governor elected in November. I sent her a letter earlier this summer and said, hey, you please drop this lawsuit. That letter's on our website, AmericanEnergyInstitute.com. A week later, she instructed her Department of Justice to withdraw that lawsuit. They've dropped their case against the majors, which is a great step in the right direction. Other than, I think we just saw another dismissal last week of another case, but it's like 6 or 7 cases have been completely dismissed in the United States because these companies believe, or the plaintiffs believe, that certain companies are causing weather events, which is just absolutely absurd.
Yeah, I mean, the attribution science, I always put the science in scare quotes because it's the most absurd kind of politically motivated, ideologically motivated research out there, and it's possible to track how some of this is funded. And what I find so interesting is quite often in the acknowledgments or in like a little footnote in there, or even sometimes in the research policy itself or the research document, the researcher will say, this is intended to support litigation. And it's like, wait a second, I thought research was supposed to be agnostic, at least in the ideal world, right? But unfortunately, there are certain individuals and philanthropies who funnel money specifically into certain institutes in order to produce these studies to achieve a certain outcome that can be used in litigation to shut down hydrocarbons. So, but what is the solution? What's the solution for something like the Climate Judiciary Project? Should a person advocate for it not being allowed? Or since it's about education, would it be helpful to maybe offer an alternative educational session or insist on duality in the sense of, if you're doing if a judge is going to be sitting through a Climate Judiciary Project briefing, there should be someone who's presenting an alternative view. I mean, what's the solution there?
Yeah, I think disclosure and transparency are some of the solutions there. That we need to know which judges are attending these events, especially if they're getting their continuing education credits that they're required to get. That's been the big issue. And so you've seen some of the transparency happen through Freedom of Information Act requests here in the United States, where people have asked, have you participated in any of these events? So we're starting to get some ideas and some names, which I think will give the defendants the opportunity to dismiss more of these cases. But I think ultimately the Supreme Court needs to rule and strike all these cases down, saying that states don't have the authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, that they don't have the authority to regulate any climate issues, that's a federal, if not a global issue. And so I really think that we just need the Supreme Court to step in, full stop these cases. I think there's over 24 cases playing out in courts right now, which unfortunately in some cases you might get a win. And that would just be incredibly damaging if there is. You've got a left state with a left judge, and you could get a win. The one there's a case in Multnomah, Oregon, which is a county in Oregon where Portland is. And there'll be a hearing later this month on, I guess, a request by Chevron, because in discovery, I've written some stuff on this recently. Chevron has discovered that there was evidence, so-called research, submitted by the plaintiffs' attorneys, the ones representing Multnomah County, about some of this attribution science that it turns out the plaintiffs' attorneys had a hand in. It was the first drafts were posted on the lawyers' law firm's website. And so there's clearly some coordination happening here between these so-called research writers and the plaintiff's attorney. It's complete corruption. Not only do these pieces of so-called evidence need to be thrown out, the entire case needs to be thrown out for judicial impropriety.
Do you think that will happen?
Probably not in Oregon, but I see the research being dismissed. I mean, but the case probably not at this point in time. It'll wait until it gets up to a higher court, I imagine. But who knows? There's been some left-leaning jurisdictions that have completely dismissed some of these cases already. So I remain cautiously optimistic, but not so much in Portland, Oregon.
Yeah, exactly. Oregon. Oh my gosh. So what do you think is the impact of the cost of litigation on the viability of hydrocarbon companies, energy prices, jobs? This seems to be death by 1,000 cuts, try to just slice away revenue and profits away from the companies. So what do you think the costs of litigation are?
They're astronomical. I mean, the legal fees that these companies are incurring is ultimately what happens is those costs are getting passed on to the consumers. The consumers are paying higher costs for energy. This is not part of the America First energy dominance agenda of the current administration, because again, when you increase the cost, you increase the cost to consumers. And so that's to me is the most detrimental thing that we're seeing here, where we see an effort to reduce the cost of energy, not only here in the United States, but around the world. And we can do that with our energy. So it's just really unfortunate, some of the impacts that we're seeing, not only globally, but here in the United States. I mean, as Chris Wright, our Secretary of Energy, talks about the 7 billion people that don't have access to energy, you've got this coordinated effort with 39 of the top 40 economies in the world that won't allow funds to flow into countries if they're developing infrastructure based on hydrocarbons. So there's been a move of the Human Rights Tribunal. This is another climate litigation piece where Greenpeace was found guilty in North Dakota for essentially, I'll use the term terrorism. They were hiring paid protesters that were locking themselves to equipment, that were damaging equipment, that were leaving maybe 40 million tons of trash behind at these so-called protests, which was just a coordinated acting event. They were found liable for that. $660 million judgment against Greenpeace North America. And so what happens is Greenpeace International is now suing Energy Transfer, the company involved at the center of this effort. They're now suing Energy Transfer in a European court. And so they're trying to, and the EU passed this anti-SLAPP provision, this defamation provision, if you will, that says that they can go after companies that even operate outside of the EU. So Greenpeace International, through this Human Rights Tribunal, if you will, is trying to impact energy production here in the United States, even if the company doesn't do business in the EU. And I really think that the people that should be called before a Human Rights Tribunal should be the people that are the leaders of the companies and the economies and these countries that are denying access to capital to help lift the world's poor out of poverty. That's exactly what the World Economic Forum is doing, the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, the UN. You look at some of these countries and companies that are involved in this effort to deny access to capital to developing country is keeping women in poverty around the world. And I say women because they're the ones that are most burdened by energy poverty. Today, women, this is according to UNICEF, today women will spend 200 million hours walking to collect water. My wife is not going to spend that much time walking to collect water. That's borne upon the least among us more than anyone else. They're going to spend over 3 miles walking, so over 5 kilometers walking to gather water. They'll spend an hour today walking to collect biomass, some sort of animal dung or other wood or things that they can burn to heat that water up to make that water somewhat potable. And their life expectancies are going to be 20 years less than that of ours. That to me is when people talk about environmental justice, that's the real environmental justice I see. Who's holding the people that are causing these and keeping these people in abject poverty? Who's holding them accountable? And I think that's what needs to be brought before a human rights tribunal.
Yeah, not the activities of a pipeline company in America. I mean, that's just insane.
Exactly.
There's a Kenyan farmer named Jasper Muchago. I don't know if you follow him on X or anything.
Great. Yes.
Yeah, he's amazing. And you know, he really brings to life the challenges in his small community where it's basically subsistence farming, and how he had to build a well that's closer to his village just because, like you were describing, the people, the women and the children had to walk so far just to get water. And then, of course, Robert Bryce has been amazing in highlighting the plight of women in places like India. India's got this huge, over 1 billion people. Not everybody has access to electricity. A lot of them just kind of, you know, tap into electricity lines to try and get whatever they can, whatever electrons they can. But women end up, you know, like you said, collecting biomass, which is dung or whatever, burning that inside their house, which creates all kinds of air quality problems. So if you're worried about a car, I'd be more worried about that cow dung being burned in my house in order to cook food or whatever. So we, you know, by doing these litigation against North American, Western companies, it really deprives the possibility of developing nations to get out of that poverty cycle. And it's really disgusting, actually, that Greenpeace is making this case in the EU. There's so many problems with what the EU is doing, and how it's really terrible for women and children, but they always claim that they're being helpful to women, which is just not true.
It's absolutely absurd. Some of the EU's corporate sustainability directives that they have, there's the CSRD and the CS3D, and then there's the cross-border adjustment mechanism, which is essentially a carbon tax. And then now you have the anti-SLAPP provisions. I mean, they are just continuing their assault on American energy. They're essentially cutting their nose to spite their face, which is awful. But you talk about India. You know, I like to talk about Sri Lanka, very similar population geography to India. What was happening in Sri Lanka is they were having economic prosperity that was outpacing that of India and other surrounding countries. And Sri Lanka was exporting tea, and they were exporting rice. They were growing these crops, and they were experiencing this path to prosperity, outpacing their neighbors. I'm not going to say they were at first world prosperity like we experienced, but they were getting closer to that. And I tell my boys all the time that time travel exists. It's just called travel. You can go to places like Sri Lanka that live like we lived 100 years ago. You can go to places where there's people living a couple hundred years ago. I mean, it's just called travel, and you can do time travel. But in Sri Lanka, they were experiencing this pathway to prosperity. And then they had this candidate that ran for office in 2019. And he said, I'm the first ever net zero candidate on the face of the earth. And at the time, Sri Lanka had the highest ESG rating of any country on the earth. And so this net zero candidate gets elected in 2019, and he immediately bans the use and importation of nitrogen-based fertilizers. So he bans these fertilizers because they're produced using natural gas. And what happens in Sri Lanka? Food production drops 40% almost overnight. I mean, it took a year for this to play out, but food production dropped 40% food cost went up 80%. They were no longer exporting tea and rice. They were importing rice. They were hungry. 9 in 10 people in Sri Lanka became hungry on a daily basis as a result of these net zero policies put in place by one person, by one politician with one policy. It shows how one person can be so devastating to an entire economy that had bought into this Green New scam. And really, it's the UN's propaganda they've been pushing. I've had an opportunity to visit places like Myanmar in 2016. We're in the Department of Energy building, and the power goes out 3 times during an hour-long meeting. And it was because they were gracious enough to turn on the window unit for us Americans as we're sweating, they're at 110% humidity and it's over 90 degrees inside the building. It was appalling, but they're like, oh, we'll be gracious to our guests and turn on the air conditioning, and the power trips off in the Department of Energy building multiple times. And they wanted to talk not about natural gas, not about importing LNG to lift the poor people out of poverty, not to power an industrial revolution in Myanmar. They want to talk about wind and solar because that's what the UN is pushing and bribing them to utilize. Oh, but the UN offers us this if we increase our solar. And it was just kind of a slap in the face to me that a poor country is embracing things that are just going to keep them impoverished. To wrap the on Sri Lanka, the president, he didn't finish his 3-year term. He fled the country on a fossil fueled military plane. And didn't go to places like Malawi or Ethiopia that are living at net zero. He went to Singapore, the highest per capita emissions on the face of the earth. So it's the high carbon lifestyle for him, but not for the people that he was supposed to serve. I'm glad he fled. I don't know if Sri Lanka has recovered. It's going to take some time. They began importing and becoming more and more dependent on China, as the rest of the world has as well.
Yeah, that's a really great point about China, but I'm glad you brought up Sri Lanka, because that to me is the absolute case study for what happens when you try to flip the switch to net zero overnight and the devastating consequences of that. Now, of course, there's people in the Western world, in America, Canada, Europe, UK, who will say, well, they just didn't manage it properly, that we can manage this better and plan where food's going to be grown, and we'll get rid of cows and all this other kinds of stuff. But you made a really great point about the investment and how these developing nations, they're unfortunately dependent upon foreign investors in order to fund whatever infrastructure buildup they need. And the Western countries put the strings attached with wind and solar and batteries or whatever, and organic and no fossil fuels and all this kind of stuff. China doesn't always have those strings attached, although they've supposedly been persuaded to not fund coal anymore. But who knows what else they're funding. But I think BlackRock plays a bit of a key thing here. And you had a report, I think it's this one. No, that's not it. It was about, is it this one?
There it is.
Yeah, behind the smoke screen, where Texas, maybe you could give us a little bit of some background on the legislation that Texas passed that boycotted BlackRock because it was trying to discriminate against oil, gas, coal, cattle, etc. And then we can get into a bit of a conversation about what their more global positions are.
Sure. It was interesting. In 2019, it was really the first time. I had just left the legislature in Texas after serving 4 terms, and I started to hear this term ESG. I like many people, what's ESG? And so now it's interesting because some of my members and board members of the organization I lead it's this so-called environmental, social, and governance scoring metric that companies are using against American energy producers. And so that's really began my investigation and research into this discrimination against American energy companies. They're also discriminating against forestry companies, agriculture, cattle companies. I mean, the list goes on and on. If it's a politically unfavored industry, according to the left, like guns and ammunition, they're going to target them. So people came to me and said, Jason, you've got to fix this. So I worked with really closely our lieutenant governor in the state of Texas. to craft a piece of legislation. We worked on 2020, then Texas goes into a legislative session in 2021, and Senate Bill 13 becomes this priority piece of legislation, and it passes overwhelmingly with bipartisan support. Now, if that bill were introduced today, there's no way it would have bipartisan support. And I'm not even convinced it would pass. I didn't think it would pass in 2021. I thought we had a long shot. But it basically says if you're going to boycott energy companies, then you can't do business with the state of Texas. Now, the funny thing was I got to define what boycott meant because people are like, oh, we invest billions of dollars into oil and gas, so we don't boycott them. And I said, well, by my definition, if you're forcing those companies to do something that gets counter to their best interest, then you're boycotting them. You're trying to invest in them to manipulate them. And just recently, just this summer, and I was very clear that the bill had to say fossil fuels, not oil and gas. It had to say fossil fuels because I knew that some of these companies had very clear divestment positions against coal. And when I wrote the first draft of the bill, it had forestry products, it had agricultural commodities in there because we knew that those were starting to get targeted. It wasn't as public as it is now. But so what happened is the bill passed, fossil fuels, and just this summer, a judge ruled that BlackRock was seeking to dismiss a lawsuit where the state of Texas is going after BlackRock for their policies on coal. And a judge ruled this case is going to continue because you did what you said you were going to do. You were going to invest in these companies to get them to produce less coal to meet your climate. And I'm paraphrasing here. But that's also, I think, some information on this report. There's also some information on our website about that court ruling, but this is huge. We worked with Consumers Research to really put this summary together that shows that even though BlackRock was taken off of the boycott list in Texas, I think that was a political move. They've invested in our Texas Stock Exchange. They're investing in infrastructure. I think they bought themselves off of our boycott list by our former comptroller 2 days before he was leaving office. He took them off of the list. And so that it was really frustrating, but they continue to boycott oil, gas, coal, and cattle. Right after we published this report, the issues with Cracker Barrel come out. Like Cracker Barrel is going through this rebrand, and it turns out BlackRock, that owns about 14% of Cracker Barrel, was voting for proxies, these resolutions before Cracker Barrel to make them report their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And it's important to note that the scope 3 emissions could be an employee that works remotely, and sometimes they have to commute in, sometimes they have to go to the airport. How do you calculate that? Even the Biden administration, during the Biden administration, their Securities and Exchange Commission came out and said, those are impossible to report. We're not even going to require any kind of compliance with reporting scope 3 emissions. It's absurd, it's impossible, and way too costly. But yet BlackRock continues to vote for these resolutions to target oil and gas, coal, and cattle to the detriment of the consumers. But they're really still forcing actions of these companies to discriminate against the best interests of those companies and their shareholders.
Yeah, and I like how in this report Behind the Smokescreen, you discuss how BlackRock hasn't actually stopped doing what they said. Oh yeah, we're not targeting fossil fuels anymore. We're actually, but when you look at what they're voting on, what the company is requiring of certain companies, that you're right. It seems like they should not have been removed from that list. But I'm wondering, is there a solution for determining whether or not BlackRock's in legal compliance? I mean, who makes that decision? Is it left up to the lieutenant governor? Is there a set of criteria that lawmakers use to determine whether or not a company ought to be on the list or not? I mean, how exactly does that work?
It's really left up to our comptroller of public accounts, which is essentially our state treasurer here in Texas. And it was the gentleman that was in that position. He resigned to take a job at higher education. And so we have an acting comptroller now. I have sent that acting comptroller a letter requesting the information as to what led to the decision to remove BlackRock from the boycott list in Texas because they are continuing to discriminate against the industries that are important and vital to Texas economic prosperity, and yet to receive a response. It's been several months. We'll see if I can get a response soon. If not, maybe I have to go public with that request so that people can see that we're just not getting a response from the action that was taken. But ultimately, that authority lies with the comptroller. And you're continuing to see more and more investigations at the federal level. These companies like BlackRock are buying utilities now. Before they were, you look at every investor-owned utility in the state of Texas, this is likely the case nationally here in the United States. BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street own about 20% combined, minimum of 20% combined of between those three companies of every single investor-owned utility. Now BlackRock is going out through their infrastructure company and buying Minnesota Power. They're going to continue to force their ESG goals onto ratepayers, and that's part of the purchase agreement of this newly announced deal in Minnesota, where they're going to expand spend on transmission and so-called renewable generation, which means they're going to pass those costs on to ratepayers. So it's completely detrimental to grid reliability and certainly affordability.
Well, it's interesting. I heard Larry Fink talk, I think it was at Davos this year. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's where it was, where he was talking about how what they really need is reliable, affordable energy for AI. And how it was really important for BlackRock to be investing in the infrastructure that will create that reliable, affordable energy for AI. And it got me thinking that, okay, so they will invest in some money for that to make sure that AI has reliable, affordable energy so that it can be used to monitor what everybody else does and uses, which will be solar and wind. So citizens will have unreliable energy, but the AI that will be monitoring our usage of unreliable energy will have reliable, cheaper energy because it has to be cost effective for the AI to be managing us. Um, I thought that was
Yeah, it's like
interesting.
he's learning the current administration's talking points, but
Yeah.
unfortunately his actions show otherwise. I was really disappointed that President Trump had an event in Pittsburgh, and I see Larry Fink sitting over there, kind of in the corner, a little bit hidden, but
Yeah.
still at this big horseshoe-shaped table because they own a big investment company. They're a big infrastructure company that's going to be investing in some of this infrastructure. Which is, and they're using, you got to think about this. When I first wrote this bill in 2020, I referred to it as the Pension Protection Act. And
Yeah.
because you look at the $13 trillion that BlackRock oversees as the largest financial institution in the world, and it's a lot of that money is pension dollars. It's states like New York and California who have entrusted BlackRock to provide returns. And ultimately, if those pensions and those investments don't pan out, then who's left on the hook? It's the taxpayers. So that's why it's so important that we have as much transparency as possible. But more than that, it's these fiduciaries actually keeping their fiduciary duty to the investors that have been entrusted with the billions of dollars that they manage.
Right. So I want to throw a few things out here with respect to these large institutional investors and BlackRock in particular. So first of all, quite often when they have these ESG frameworks, as I'm sure you know, there's been talk, and it was I think in the Harvard Corporate Law Review, one of their journals, where they put forward the idea, some lawyers, that it would be feasible and helpful if institutional investors bought into companies and then helped phase them out, so they could have this nice trajectory of phasing out, especially if they're high emitting companies and so on. But let's say an institutional investor like BlackRock, they have a large portfolio of different types of investments. If they're committed to net zero and of monitoring their emissions and the emissions on their books, as part of their financed emissions, they can balance that with offsets. And so if they go into a developing nation and say, hey, we need you to, we'll only fund your infrastructure if it's wind and solar and build transmission lines and so on. And we want you to preserve your forest, and we'll pay you to preserve your forest, which is one of the things they did in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I'm not sure if BlackRock was involved in that. I know John Kerry was, and his investment firm that he's with, I think Tom Steyer, I'm not sure. But so they paid the Congo to preserve a forest that they could then use as offsets for their larger portfolio. So there's that element. I don't know how that's helpful for pensioners, but it helps balance their ESG portfolio. And then with respect to BlackRock, is it not a conflict of interest now that Larry Fink is the temporary chair of the World Economic Forum? Because the World Economic Forum is absolutely committed to a 45% reduction in emissions by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050. So how can he be the head of BlackRock and say, oh yeah, we support oil, gas, fossil fuels and cattle and all these other things, and be the head of the World Economic Forum, which is the opposite? So is that not a conflict
It
of
really
interest?
is. And that's one of these globalist organizations that's driving this forced energy transition. And you talk about the Congo, it's like, hey, if you preserve this forest, essentially what they're doing in these cases is it's back to the economic development. We're not going to invest dollars into your country to build infrastructure based on hydrocarbons. And so they go to the leaders of these developing countries or these third world countries and offer them large sums of money not to invest in infrastructure. And then they say, well, if they had invested in coal or natural gas, electric generation, they would have had this many emissions. And so by not, they're keeping their emissions low. So we're going to take the difference as a credit.
Yeah.
And this is an area that I'm researching right now and learning about this, because then they take those credits and create them into a digital coin and sell them as so-called carbon credits, which they're selling absolutely nothing. They're selling nothing, but they're making massive amounts of money on this, so that companies like BP and Shell, who have also embraced this net zero forced energy transition to the benefit of China, have said, okay, then we'll buy these credits. Credits is such a scam when it comes to so-called environmental credits. I did a lot of research on this. We published a paper on the EV mandate, the deep state EV mandate. We start peeling the layers of onions, the layers of the onion back. And there's this, Tesla made over $2 billion in revenue last year because of the sale of credits. Yeah. So they're selling they got this arbitrary number that gave them over 700 miles per gallon credit for every EV they sold. So every EV, 700 miles per gallon credit, multiply times the charge. So it's thousands of credits that they're getting to sell to other automobile manufacturers so they can arbitrarily reduce their corporate average fuel economy to get in line with the federal requirements without having to pay a penalty. This is one of the biggest victories in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, is that corporate average fuel economy credit got set to $0.00. So $2 billion essentially in revenue for Tesla became absolutely worthless. And it's just air. They're trading these credits back and forth. There's no value for them to consumers. So huge win there. We see the same thing with a carbon capture scam. That's exactly what it is, trading credits to the detriment of the least among us.
Right. And it's interesting because Mark Carney has been one of the key players behind what he calls high integrity voluntary carbon markets. And he was at a panel with China last year before he threw his hat in the ring to be leader of Canada. And he's on this panel with Philip Hildebrand from BlackRock and the former head of the Chinese National Bank. And they were talking about how these voluntary carbon markets are really important so that investors will be able to offset and do all this different kinds of stuff. And then also what they call nature-related climate solutions. So that would be this policy they have for Canada signed on to it. The US did. I don't know if Trump's got rid of it, but it's to set aside 30% of land for conservation by 2030, 50% of it by 2050. So the EU, Canada, some of the other Western countries have signed on to this as part of the Kunming, Montreal biodiversity program. Um, but so then the state would have these carbon offset credits. By conserving this land, they could calculate how many emissions that they're sequestering or whatever, and they would have to be able to prove it. So now you've created this employment level of accountants, monitors, all these different kinds of things who have to go in and verify that those offsets are real, that CO2 is being captured, that it's being stored, and all this different kinds of stuff. So it creates an entirely new um, layer of bureaucracy just to prove that, okay, yeah, we have a forest and it's capturing CO2, and then having to account for if trees fall down, if there's a forest fire, and all this kinds of stuff. But this is meant to be used by the large investors like BlackRock, so they can say, we've balanced our books. We can invest in this XYZ, but we're offsetting with this other stuff. And I hope that Trump isn't following this setting aside land thing, but I know
Not
that
at
Europe
all.
and
No,
Canada.
what an egregious abuse of private property. You take people's land like that, and it's really a theft of private property, because in the United States, we've got this where you own the surface, and you can split it off, and you can own what's subsurface, and you can sell what's subsurface while you maintain what's on the surface. And that ability, I think, has been transformational for our energy production. You look at Argentina, and I've said if Argentina adopts that policy where people actually own the mineral rights below their land, that Argentina could compete with Texas for largest oil producer in the world, because they are sitting over just vast amounts of oil and natural gas. And the production is increasing there, much like it is in Guyana. I mean, it's just absolutely incredible what it's doing to these countries. Guyana is just incredible. I was reading a Wall Street Journal article about a year ago talking about the grocery stores are stocked in Guyana. They've never had choices before, and now they have choices, and it's really been transformational for their economy, their way of life, the economic prosperity that flows with producing energy. Is just incredible. But when you start taking land away from doing that, you're essentially locking people's private property from being used and produced. And that's an incredible theft of private property rights. That's what New York has done. They said they banned high pressure hydraulic fracturing to produce oil and gas, one of the safest, most responsible ways to produce it. That's led to this massive increase in production of natural gas and oil here in the United States. And New York said, nope, we're not going to do that. So there's just millions of people in New York who have completely lost access to their private property rights, which I think is theft. It's just quite appalling.
So just for the last little bit here, I wanted to add to this the screen here, where you had written this piece about Ceres, and Ceres is one of these firms that. How would you characterize what they do?
Oh, well, I imagine they're hurting a little bit now, but they're just like one of the organizations I lead. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We do research and policy, although we're a little bit different. We don't take government dollars. And for our trade organization, you can see who our members are on our website. But this is an organization that's led by Mindy Lover, former Obama administration official. She was in the EPA at the Obama administration, goes out and starts a nonprofit or leads a nonprofit. Like many of the Democrat operatives do, they shell out billions of dollars. I think in the last 70 some odd days, the Biden administration, the Department of Energy alone shelled out over $90 billion to nonprofit organizations like Stacey Abrams, who at the time had collected like maybe $200 in revenue. And all of a sudden she's given $20 billion to go out and put solar panels on people's roofs to make them more dependent on the government. Fortunately, the current administration is clawing back billions of those dollars today. I saw just today $13 billion more from the Department of Energy is being returned to the Treasury. Wow. Those are taxpayer dollars. That's incredible. But this is incredibly inflationary spending. But this is one of these organizations that takes money. They give it to think tanks. They give it to other political organizations to really try to drive a narrative. Ceres works with the Climate Action 100 initiative, which was this Paris-aligned organization to force financial institutions to stop lending money to energy production. It's part of the Net Zero's Asset Managers Initiative, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which is this Michael Bloomberg founded and funded organization that's now run it under the UN, and it is falling apart. I think one of the parts of that umbrella has completely gone away. Maybe the Net Zero Banking Initiative. There's one of them that has just completely folded up in the last couple of weeks because they were losing members that were concerned about their legal ramifications for being part of this cartel, which is exactly what it is.
Yeah, it's you mentioned before the House Judiciary Committee run by Jim Jordan, and they did this massive investigation into Ceres and the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. They interviewed Mark Carney and Mary Shapiro, who were he was the real guiding force behind it. He's the one who launched it in Glasgow in 2021. And Mary Shapiro, of course, did that one. And she did the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. She headed up that with Mark Carney also, who backed it. And he also helped when he was head of the Bank of England, set up the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is the sort of the green ESG umbrella for central banks. And they're still going strong, unfortunately. And so what the Judiciary Committee report, they did two. The recent one in December was called Sustainability Shakedown, which is like completely true. And then the first one that they did in June was called Climate Control. And then in that first one, they kind of laid the framework, the foundation, and then the second report really went into great detail about what they refer to as a sustainability shakedown. And they used ExxonMobil as the example because it's how these proxy voting groups would go in, and if they'd put forward proposals, if they didn't like the response by the company, then they plotted to remove board members. And what they referred to as the cartel, which included Ceres, installed engine number one as with two board members. Mm-hmm. Now, what's fascinating is how Exxon is proposing through the SEC now to change how these votes happen. And the activist groups like Ceres are freaking out because suddenly retail investors, if you own like shares in a company, they're creating this new way where you can vote electronically for these things instead of how it is right now, where these proxy voters come in with 0.02% of shares or whatever and suddenly get board positions and whatnot. So that Judiciary Committee was amazing in just highlighting how Ceres and these different groups collaborate, not always collude, but I would say collaborate on taking down companies they don't like. And they focus on certain companies, set the example, and then roll it out for other ones.
Yeah, and in there you've got two companies, ISS and Glass Lewis, the Institutional Shareholders Services and Glass Lewis, which are two proxy voting management companies. So pension funds, they invest in hundreds, if not thousands of different companies, and they don't want to deal with all the proxy votes. So they let ISS and Glass Lewis do it, who manage well over 90% of the market for investing all these funds. So those two companies essentially control the outcome of many of these elections, and we're voting them according to their ideology, not necessarily that of the investors. And so we've been able to expose those two companies and their collusion to drive. They're part of these climate organizations driving net zero, have made commitments to net zero in the Paris Accords. Again, not the law of the land in the United States. Don't do anything to mitigate a changing climate. Just make everything more expensive. I think they need to be called before Congress if they haven't already to answer for this. I know we've had some great hearings in Texas over this particular issue, and just some really great legislation that's been passed to push back on these efforts of these institutional investment companies and the proxy voting management companies, ISS and Glass Lewis. So I will say they've colluded, and they're certainly a cartel. and the day of reckoning is coming soon for them. And I think it's going to be quite devastating. But, it's interesting, after Exxon had its defeat by these organizations, I thought it was three. They replaced three. They were trying to get 4 board members. They replaced 3 of them. And all of a sudden, Exxon aligns with the Paris Accords. They make net zero commitments. They offload some assets that they owned in Southeast Asia, where they were going to produce oil and gas. Interesting, that was a way to decarbonize their portfolio by getting rid of assets that they were going to produce oil and gas in. That's not very good for shareholders, but they sold it to PetroChina, of all places. I mean, come on, give me a break. Just absolutely absurd. So if we're concerned about energy production, I think we'd want an American energy company producing oil and gas rather than a CCP-controlled company. But that's neither here nor there. Just absolutely appalling and egregious abuse of the trust that shareholders have in the fiduciaries that are supposed to be managing those companies.
Well, one of the interesting things that these organizations do is they insist that companies have to use science-based targets for outlining how they're going to reduce emissions and so on. And 23 Republican attorney generals are alleging cartel behavior from a group called Science-Based Target Initiative, where they create these metrics that companies are supposed to follow to identify and track how they're reducing emissions and complying with the various ESG targets and so on. And so now they're alleging that this is cartel behavior. And it's interesting that it's now moved on from series onto who's creating these metrics. And I think they ought to go after the World Resources Institute, which is one of the main ones, especially for water usage, which they're going after beef production based on this aqueduct program that they have, but that's another issue. So I hope that the AGs kind of look at beyond the Science-Based Target Initiative to other groups that are also establishing metrics, like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, because that was never intended to be an actual metric to use. It was intended just to give executives an idea. Could be where things are coming from, and you should be mindful of this. It wasn't meant to be, okay, you need to report on XYZ. So I hope that they expand their investigations.
Yeah, I think one of the big successes the Science-Based Targets Initiative had Shell as a member, and Shell has pulled out this year of that effort. So that's one of the wokest oil and gas companies there is. And now they're pulling out of that. It's like they're coming to this realization. And I'm so hopeful that our EPA here in the United States gets rid of the endangerment finding. That has been one of the biggest abuses of government bureaucracy put in 2009 by the deep state bureaucracy, not by Congress, that said CO2 is a pollutant. Give me a break. It's necessary for life on Earth. I have these bumper stickers that say carbon is life, T-shirts that say carbon is life. And people, and it's really just to challenge critical thinking, because if you think about what decarbonization is, it's the inverse of life. And that's really what this movement on the left is all about. It's a very Malthusian, control-oriented movement, which is unfortunate. But if you get rid of the endangerment finding, because CO2 is neither a pollutant, it's not harmful to human health or the environment, it's necessary for life on Earth. Quite honestly, we need more of it if we're going to continue to green the Earth and grow the food that we need to have a sustainable population. So I'm so hopeful, because that is just the foundation for all the climate policy in the United States. And if we can get rid of that foundation that is not built on solid ground out from under us, that would be incredibly helpful in reducing the cost of energy.
Yeah, that's well said. I know we're running out of time, so I'm just going to ask you one last question. In your view, what do you think are the most critical gaps in public energy literacy today? And how does AEI's research aim to bridge that?
Yeah, there's some areas that we don't have on our website of things that we work on, but education has been a passion for mine for decades now, and seeing how there's just this incredible, and I'm talking about education, kindergarten through 12th grade in the United States, is public education, private education, homeschool education. The materials that are available are demonizing of traditional fuels, those from oil, gas, coal, and nuclear. And they're very pro these alternative, unreliable sources that are dependent on some taxpayer-paid subsidies. And they're dependent on China. And I thought, gosh, so I started this project over 10 years ago to kind of remove the bias from our education system that let's just teach everybody about all forms of energy production and let them make their own minds. Let's teach them about the benefit and the cost benefit analysis of different sources of energy. So I think that's where some of the biggest gaps are right now. There's these books that are used in schools, reading comprehension, that are completely demonizing hydrocarbons, which is just absolutely appalling that they're trying to brainwash kids in kindergarten. At the youngest ages, when they're learning to read, they're getting taught about how bad hydrocarbons are, when the opposite couldn't be further, couldn't be more truthful. They're necessary for life on Earth. They're necessary for economic prosperity, which makes clean air and clean water possible. And so just really have been working for years on that effort, have had some big wins recently, working with one of the biggest education publishers in the country to remove some of the bias, this negative misinformation about traditional fuels, and update their curriculum. So I'm grateful for some of that work, because I think that's the seed that will provide the fruit in the shade 20 years from now, by changing our education system to remove the biases against certain types of energy production.
Yeah, I'm so grateful for the work that you do. I know that in my son's science class, and even in his debate class, it's all centered around renewable, like wind and solar, and how great that is, and all this different kinds of stuff. And then when he starts looking at chemistry, and he's like, hey, wait a second, actually, there's a lot in organic chemistry. It's all about carbon.
Carbon is life.
Okay, carbon is life. We're carbon-based life forms.
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
Yeah, I was like, come on. Anyway, so thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today about the various reports and the amazing work that you're doing. And I really hope that you continue to be successful in changing some of the curriculum and just make it more fair and balanced. I appreciate that.
Amen. Thanks, Tammy. I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you. Have a great day.